Ladies and gentlemen, it is a distinct honor and a privilege for me to have the opportunity to introduce to you our next keynote speaker of the day, someone I had the chance to meet briefly in Berlin when he was there in his official capacity not too long ago, Ambassador John R. Bolton. Allow me to say a few words of background about Ambassador Bolton. Ambassador John R. Bolton was appointed as United States Permanent Representative to the United Nations on August 1st, 2005. And he served until his resignation in December 2006. Prior to his appointment, Ambassador Bolton served as Undersecretary of State for Arms Control and International Security from May 2001 until May 2005. Ambassador Bolton has spent many years of his life in public service. Previous positions have included Assistant Secretary for International Organization Affairs at the Department of State. From 1989 until 1993, Assistant Attorney General, Department of Justice. From 1995 until 1989, thereafter Assistant Administrator for Program and Policy Coordination, U.S. Agency for International Development, 1982 until 1983, as well as General Counsel, U.S. Agency for International Development, 1981 until 1982. Ambassador Bolton is currently of counsel at Kirkland & Ellis, LLC, and serves as Foreign Policy Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, a nonprofit public policy center dedicated to preserving and strengthening the foundations of freedom through research education and open debate. The lecture topic that he's chosen for today, Global Challenges Confronting the United States. Ambassador Bolton, we're very honored to have you here, and I'd ask everyone to please join me in expressing a very, very sincere welcome to Ambassador John Bolton. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation to be here today. I was saying before we started that we're probably the only people in Washington who are not glued to a radio or a TV set to see what the Supreme Court is going to do in the health care matter. And so I'm going to keep my BlackBerry on here just see what the outcome is. It's an interesting measure of a variety of factors that have come together in this ruling, whether there is a limit on, constitutional limit on the Commerce Clause, empowerment of Congress to regulate interstate commerce. And all I can say is I'm prepared to be disappointed if they uphold it, because when I was a first-year law student, in the fall of 1971, we were all required to take constitutional law in our first semester, and I had the real privilege of having Alexander Bickel as my constitutional law professor. He was one of the great 20th century scholars of constitutional law, and he assured all of us when we read the case called Wickard against Filburn that from the New Deal era, that it demonstrated that there was no limit on Congress's Commerce Clause power. So I've happily believed that for 40 years now. And whatever happens today, whatever the outcome is, you can bet if you read the newspapers tomorrow, it will talk about Wickard against Filburn. So we'll see if Bickel turns out to be right, or if maybe there is a limit on the Commerce Clause. But that's not our subject today. What I thought I would try and do in my remarks, and then I'd be delighted to try and respond to your questions, is talk about three areas which for the United States are of enormous importance, and to try and by discussing how these policy areas play out, to see what exactly the role might be for cultural diplomacy, or differences in cultural understandings might be a better way to put it, and to see if in some of these areas what the possibilities are, or perhaps that there aren't any possibilities at all, because the views on some of the issues involved are so different. And I thought it would be appropriate to start with the Eurozone's ongoing financial crisis, both the sovereign debt crisis and what I think really is fundamentally more at stake there, which is the future of the euro, and whether the entire euro project made sense when they started it, whether it was really more of a political than an economic construct, and what might happen to it today, what the role of the United States ought to be. You know, if you listen to some analysts, they will argue that the Eurozone and its the European Union, rather, and its constant efforts toward further political and economic integration came upon the idea of a single currency because of the economic logic behind such a decision. If you read Mundell's theory of optimal currency areas, that the European nations, the members of the European Union, were obviously impeded in their efforts at economic growth because they were so small, not just geographically, but that their economies were so small, their populations were so small, that having different currencies was inevitably a major economic drag for them, and that therefore the creation of a common currency for the Eurozone simply made good economic sense. It would eliminate internal foreign exchange fluctuation risk. It would eliminate the transaction cost of dealing in multiple currencies. And basically, it was hard to argue if you were seeking a single market that it made sense to have different currencies. And so, in effect, what the Europeans did, or at least those Europeans who joined the Eurozone, is that along with many other sovereign powers that had been ceded to European Union institutions over the years, they ceded monetary policy in substantial part to Brussels. But what they didn't cede was fiscal policy, tax and budget authority, which were kept at the national capital level, theoretically constrained by rules about acceptable levels of deficits and rules on spending and taxation that were intended to ensure that that the different decisions of what turned out to be the 17 countries that joined the Eurozone wouldn't contradict the monetary policy that was being formulated by the European Central Bank and other institutions. And I well remember in 1997, I was with my former boss, Jim Baker, in Lisbon, in Portugal, where I was helping him out. We were volunteers for the United Nations trying to resolve the Western Sahara crisis, which I like to call then the last and least significant remaining Cold War crisis. But anyway, we were in Portugal because they had allowed us all to go there to negotiate, and the Portuguese foreign minister gave a small dinner in Jim Baker's honor. In the course of this, Baker, reflecting not his days as Secretary of State, but as Secretary of the Treasury, said to the Portuguese, this is 1997, said to the Portuguese foreign minister, well, what exactly are the benefits that you're going to get if Portugal joins the Eurozone? And the foreign minister, who was, of course, an elected official in a parliamentary system, said, well, I wouldn't say this publicly in Portugal, you know, but we have never been able to balance our budget. We don't have the discipline to do it. Successive governments come in, they compete for popular votes by spending programs, and so it just goes on and on and on. We come to periodic devaluations because we just can't restrain ourselves. But if we join the euro, we're going to be bound by these fiscal policy rules that will force us to balance the budget. It will instill discipline in our fiscal policy, and then with everything else that's good about the euro, this has got to be a very good thing for Portugal. And all I can say there is famous last words, because Portugal, Greece, and other governments have found that the fiscal rules simply didn't apply. They weren't enforced. Nobody paid any attention to them. And over time, the constant reiteration of fiscal policy that led to massive national deficits eventually started forcing the yields of their national sovereign debt apart, until we saw the crisis erupt 2 years ago in Greece and now having spread to many, many other countries. So that the European project, the entire Union, but the Eurozone in particular, having melded the Germans on the one hand and Club Med, as they call it, on the other hand, is in a really, I think, an existential crisis at this point. Now, that some would say, well, that calls into question the economic arguments in favor of the Eurozone. and to an extent, I suppose it does. But this whole discussion and what you see reported in financial pages, what you hear most in terms of the analysts debating what the next step for the European countries involved is really limited to economics and financial advice. And I don't really think that is going to be enough to solve their problem, in part because I believe that although there are strong economic arguments for a common currency in the European Union, the fundamental reason for the euro was political, that the whole purpose was designed to drive both economic and political integration in the European Union to a more and more centralized level. And the feeling was that the euro would contribute to greater economic integration, which would push for more political integration, and that inevitably people would see, having centralized monetary authority, that there was there were strong arguments to centralize fiscal policy and other national policies as well. And this political theory stemmed in part from what I think can only be described as a theology in Europe, that their problems in the last 100+ years, beginning with the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, World Wars I and World War II, was excessive nationalism. And the cure to excessive nationalism was to eliminate nations. So the way you do that is you create the European Union and devolve authority away from the nation state toward Brussels. And so this was a continuing part of that effort. But there was another political element that European elites believed in, maybe not European citizens, who rarely get a chance to opine on these things, but European elites looking at the circumstances after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s. One of the arguments, although theorizing and some preparatory work for the euro had begun in years past, one of the predominant views among elites, political elites in Europe in the 1990s after the collapse of the Soviet Union was that the world had gone from a bipolar standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union to what they called a unipolar world, that there was only the United States and everybody else was sort of flailing around. Hubert Védrine, the foreign minister of France in the late 1990s, called the United States a hyperpuissance, hyperpower, and he did not mean that as a compliment. So for a lot of European leaders, the idea of a common currency was very important to create Europe, which is always, which they intend as a political designation as opposed to a geographic describer, that Europe would be an alternative pole to the United States, and that the euro would be both a manifestation of that alternative pole and an alternative to the dollar as a world currency. So that this political driving force, rarely expressed publicly, was something that was very strongly felt. And so when you put that together with the other political arguments and the economic arguments, led 17 members, as it turned out, to join the euro. Now, there's a cynical version of this narrative too. Almost every prominent economist who was asked to comment on the structure of the euro when it was finally decided, moving monetary but not fiscal policy to Brussels, said this isn't going to work. You can't create a currency without a government. And, you know, by the way, in democratic societies, it would be nice if the government were elected by real people as opposed to being decided by cabinet ministers and diplomats and the like. And I think, at least in this alternative narrative, many European leaders knew that they were entering into a much riskier project with the euro than they were prepared to admit publicly. And here's the covert narrative. And they figured that there are one of two possibilities. Either the euro is going to work, as I described previously, and foster economic and political integration, or it won't work, in which case we will argue for more political integration as the only solution. and that will happen, and therefore, even though we weren't able to get fiscal union at this go-round, we only got monetary union, we'll get fiscal union soon enough, either through success or through failure. This more cynical narrative is because of another element of the European theology, which the phrase they use is, you must always keep riding the bicycle, meaning closer European political integration. If you fall off the bicycle or you get a flat tire, you just get back, thank you very much, you just get back on the bicycle and keep riding. So now we are at the point, either from the cynical view or from the view of those who were asked about the prospects for Europe, that we are in a crisis. That the fiscal policy rules that were adopted at the time the euro was put into play were violated, they were ignored, there were no penalties, and now the question is, so how do we get out of this mess? And we've watched this drama unfold for 2 years. Today and tomorrow we're having another European Union summit, or Eurozone summit, that has been described as the most important European summit in history, as were the last dozen or so that we've had over the last 2 years. And every indication is that the Europeans, having tried to kick this can down the road as far as they can, will probably try and kick it down the road a little bit further. There's only one European leader, I think, with a really coherent view of what to do, and that's Chancellor Merkel. And her view is the standard European line, which is we need more political and economic integration, and therefore Germany is not going to open its checkbook until everybody agrees to centralize fiscal authority in Brussels. And she's walking a very difficult line. She knows if she's freer with German resources, whether mutualizing the sovereign debt in the form of euro bonds, which is what the solution of the day is, or any other expansion of Germany's balance sheet to help the Club Med and other countries, she lessens the pressure to get the integration that she wants. Now, of course, on the other hand, if she holds out too long, the whole ship is going to go over the falls, and it will cause great economic disruption for Germany as well as for some of the other, the so-called peripheral countries that are bearing the real hardship now, finding that they're getting priced out of international capital markets. The trouble is, of course, even if she's right, and I don't necessarily think she is, but even if she's right, this isn't going to happen overnight. And the financial markets are a unforgiving sort of people. They're not going to wait for 5 years of negotiation. It's possible that she can pull this off, but what it says to me is that whatever happens today and tomorrow, Europe is running out of time for kicking the can down the road and is going to have to move sooner rather than later to one of two corner solutions. Either the Eurozone breaks up, that's one corner solution, or you get what Merkel wants, which is vastly more centralization of authority in Brussels. I don't know which it's going to be. If I were to bet, I would bet that the more likely outcome is that the euro itself breaks up, the Eurozone itself breaks up, because some countries, seeing no real alternative other than devaluation, have to abandon the euro and readopt national currencies, or a theory that a couple of years ago was just sort of laughed at, but now serious people are writing about, is that Germany leaves the euro and says, the rest of you people take care of this problem, we're getting out of here, with a couple of their satellites, I'll call them, that economically really can't separate themselves from Germany. So the net of this is that the crisis of the euro, while it may yet end up with more centralization, at least in the short term, is having a divisive effect on euro. It is going backwards in terms of the effort at political integration, and you can see this sometimes. Humor is at its best when it's operating room humor. This is what passes for a joke in Greece these days. A plane lands from in Athens from Berlin. Everybody gets out and goes up to the customs and immigration inspectors. A guy comes up, the Greek immigration inspector says, state your name, Schmidt, nationality, German, occupation, no, I'm just here for the weekend. So this is not exactly fostering European integration of either sort. But obviously one question that they ask is, well, how about the rest of you people helping us out? How about the IMF, which has participated to a certain extent? How about the United States? How about other non-European, non-Eurozone treasuries coming to our rescue? Because after all, you've all got assets in euros or in Eurozone financial institutions, and if we go down, just like the financial crisis of 2008, all of you are going to go down too. And what's interesting here is that although the IMF has provided a certain amount of assistance, at least in the case of Greece, there has been enormous resistance and reluctance in the United States to do anything much more than that. And indeed, there is opposition to any U.S. participation in a further expansion of the IMF's financial capabilities. Now, that's in part because Republicans have said no and hell no, and in part because the Obama administration is fixated on November the 6th, and they are not going to do anything between now and November the 6th to come to Europe's assistance for political reasons. What they might do after that, if the president's reelected, remains to be seen. But again, these have been largely economic considerations. I think there should be a political consideration, and that is, I don't see why the United States should help rescue a project whose central purpose, in my view, was to establish an alternative pole for the United States. Europeans are perfectly free to try and set up a common currency. So is Central America, so is Sub-Saharan Africa, so is anybody else. You're perfectly free to do it, but don't expect us to help you out. And I think there's important history here as well. There have been a lot of efforts at European Union over the centuries. Charlemagne had an idea of European Union. Napoleon had an idea of European Union. Hitler had an idea of European Union. There are a lot of ideas about European Union. Some have come from conquest, some in other directions. But the phenomenon of a more united Europe does have profound implications for the United States. And I still accept Thomas Jefferson's view. He was obviously commenting in the Napoleonic era when he said it cannot be in America's interest to see all of Europe united under a single crown. And even though I will grant you Herman von Rompuy, a common name, I'm sure you're all intimately familiar with the President of Europe. If you didn't know they had one, ask Herman. He'd be happy to tell you. He doesn't exactly look like Napoleon, but I still think that the question of a united Europe is something that has broad implications for the United States. And this is something I think many Europeans are having a great deal of difficulty understanding because of the expectation after we have pushed for European integration since the days of the Marshall Plan, when we tried to solve the initial problem of how to allocate Marshall Plan resources by encouraging the Europeans to decide together how to allocate those resources. And we've encouraged virtually every step of European integration, and we've urged more political unity. There's even a story this morning in the paper, coincidentally, about Henry Kissinger's famous line, which may be apocryphal, but he at least likes to take credit for, or says it's a good line. When I need to talk to Europe, who do I call? And, they're not, U.S. Supreme Court strikes down President Obama's health care law requiring Americans to buy health insurance. Nothing about severability. More to come. Sorry. I apologize for being distracted, but this is a, as Vice President Biden said, I won't quote him fully, this is a big deal. that I think Europeans, by and large, the reaction I've sensed is that they're very distressed with the United States because we're not prepared to provide the sort of safety net that they expect or that they would hope for. And I think this is this is why the resolution of the European sovereign debt crisis is ultimately going to be extremely important for the transatlantic relationship and for the strength of the West with a small w throughout the world. That if this results in a further diminution of European strength, political and economic, that is something that harms the United States as well. And while that may seem to argue in favor of the United States coming more to the rescue of the Europeans, you know, the problem really comes back to the European project itself. It's manifested in the euro, but it's also embodied in many other aspects of the European Union. Today, on the world stage, the European Union is less than the sum of its parts. It's the exact opposite of what the framers and guiders of the European project wanted and expected. It's something that I think has taken everybody by surprise. You know, in the 50s and 60s, when they first began to talk about a common market, using the Treaty of Rome, 1957, to create a free trade area, people used to talk about the United States of Europe. And for most people in the United States, they said, well, this is the United States of America, United States of Europe, that sounds pretty good, United States of Africa, United States of Asia, whatever. But it's a very, very different prospect. The United States grew in a unique way. This is why we talk about American exceptionalism. Europe grew in a different way. And when you have the kind of top-down unification process that the European project has embodied, you're going to run into problems over the years. And it turns out it's manifested in the euro crisis, the sovereign debt crisis, not so much in a political crisis, but I think it is playing out now in a political crisis in Europe and potentially political disarray across the transatlantic alliance. And that's that may be surprising, but this is in the context of bilateral relationships between the U.S., its NATO allies, other European countries, whether they're in the European Union or not, that are as close and intense as any that the United States has anywhere in the world, by definition, given the history of it. And yet none of that has helped alleviate the crisis, and in fact, perhaps it has exacerbated them. Well, let me stop there. I was going to go on and talk about the Middle East. That would only take about another 3 hours. But I'm happy to answer questions, obviously not just about the Euro zone crisis or its implications, but really anything that's on your mind that you might have covered in the last 2 days of the conference, or anything of interest to you. Yes, sir.
Ambassador, I'm a retired ambassador, and you just never give it up. You always have it for life. Bill McCormick. I was recently in Italy, and when you're shopping in Florence, you get two prices, one for cash and one for the credit card. And I didn't buy anything, but I walked outside, and the fellow asked me, he said, you know, there's an ATM machine right outside if you need cash. There was a line of tourists standing in line to get their cash so they could go back to their stores and buy the item that they had set aside. Getting down on the trenches, how do you deal with the retirement systems of Greece? How do you deal with the unreported incomes of Italy? How do you deal with the underground economy of the EU?
Well, I think it's a very good question, and you know, the Europeans have spent decades not dealing with these questions, and that's why it seems to me any outcome here is going to be enormously wrenching for the economies of everybody in the Eurozone, and that includes Germany, which many people think has benefited from the euro to spur its own exports to other Eurozone countries. But it seems to me that whether the euro stays, whether fiscal authority goes to Brussels, whether the eurozone breaks up, ultimately the Europeans have got to address these fundamental structural problems that they have avoided for so long. You know, it would help in any of the rescue plan for Greece or the bailout conditions or anything else to have some economic growth there. And I don't mean stimulus spending by the Greek government. I mean real, honest, entrepreneurial economic activity that adds value to raw materials and creates wealth, which they're not. They have not been doing. I was in Greece last summer, and people were in denial, except they understood that young Greeks were leaving because they didn't see any long-term opportunity there, which is obviously a huge loss for Greek society going forward, not to mention the loss of the tax revenue from these young people paying into the extraordinary pension plans that they've got. I was just in Portugal about a month ago, and you know, you can wander through some really upscale neighborhoods in Lisbon and see boarded-up buildings, bricked-up buildings. Economic activity in Lisbon very hard to find. A lot of interest in the soccer championships, but not much economic activity. And until that changes, the financial wizards can run the numbers day in and day out, and it won't change the underlying reality. And the underlying reality is that they've got a real economic crisis. Whether the euro contributed to it in some respects, which I think it did, or not, really doesn't address the absence of real economic growth in far too many European countries. Yes, sir.
Many questions. We'll go here, and then I think also Dr. Nazar wanted to.
Hello, Mr. Ambassador. My name is Zeke Botokuma. I'm a philosopher and founder of Polyglots in Action for Diversity. 1 week ago, exactly before this meeting here, I had the opportunity of attending a debate at the Embassy of France organized by the Le Monde Diplomatique and La Maison Française. And the title of the debate was, "Is the United Nations declining?" And I'm asking this question to you, if you can give a short answer, because I know you were also a U.S. ambassador to the UN. And from some of the report and conversations about your attitude and position vis-à-vis the UN, you were very critical about the organization. And I do believe that the global challenges confronting the US are also challenges that sometimes may also involve some collaboration with the UN. And I just want to see what you would say about the question, is the UN declining? And especially in light of your experience and critical position to the organization.
Yeah, well, thank you. I mean, if you pose it in terms of is the UN declining, you'd have to say from what point and how far. But just to describe the UN today, it is a vast, sprawling operation. I think that's part of its problem, is that it's too large, too duplicative, too unwieldy. But there are elements of it that do important work, largely in the specialized agencies that people don't pay attention to, and which are successful because they stick to their fairly well-defined mandates. My favorite, the Universal Postal Union, which predates the UN, but which is part of the UN system. The International Maritime Organization, the International Civil Aviation Organization, and others like that do perform important functions in the international system. The problem with the UN and the difficulty that many Americans have with it and others around the world is that its political institutions are fundamentally ineffective. And by that I mean the General Assembly, the Security Council, Human Rights Council, and other bodies like that. And I don't see in the international dynamic anything that's necessarily going to change that. Let's just take the Security Council and do the 60-second history of the Security Council since 1945. Almost from the beginning, it was gridlocked by the Cold War up until 1989 and the collapse of the Berlin Wall and fall of the Soviet Union. So in the transcendental struggle of the second half of the 20th century of communism against freedom, the UN was completely irrelevant. Now, there were things that happened in the UN during that time that were in the Security Council that were beneficial, but in the key aspect of the world as a whole, it was just a non-player. Now, after the Soviet Union broke apart, many people said, and I certainly shared some of that optimism in the early 1990s, that now the Security Council can move beyond that, and maybe even the General Assembly. And it was that feeling that led us, for example, in the first Bush administration in 1991 to make a huge diplomatic effort to repeal the General Assembly Resolution 3379 that declared Zionism a form of racism. That was a 1975 action by the non-aligned movement and the communist bloc that for many Americans just caused them to tune out from the UN entirely, that it was a fundamentally illegitimate act. One of my predecessors, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, went to the podium of the General Assembly, ripped the resolution up, said we will never abide by it, which pretty well summed up a lot of people's views. So the effort to repeal it in 1991, we felt was, number one, righting a huge wrong, but number two, taking the stain off the UN's reputation, and thereby providing for a lot of people in the U.S. and elsewhere a greater degree of confidence that the UN going forward would be more productive. But unfortunately, it didn't work out that way, and I think you can see in the 20 years, roughly 20 plus years since the fall of the Berlin Wall, that in what I think are the great issues of these 2 decades, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction and the war against terrorism, again, the Security Council has been at best a minor player, and the General Assembly hasn't been helpful at all. Now, and you know, if you need any recent proof, look at the double veto cast by Russia and China against the West. Last effort at increased Security Council sanctions against the Assad regime now 3, almost 4 months ago. So I think that the blunt reality is that the UN's political institutions reflect the world as a whole, and nobody should have any expectations from the UN's political bodies that they will do anything other than reflect the world as a whole. And until that changes, and I don't think that it will, the UN isn't going to change. And so looking for major political issues to be resolved there is just unrealistic, I think.
Okay, I think the next question is Dr. Nazar, and then we'll come back.
Thank you very much. Actually, I was tempted to ask you about the Middle East and the Arab Spring, but I'll stick to the core of your topic or your speech today. And you have confirmed that there is a strong relationship between the economy in Europe and the economy in the United States. And if there is a shake-up to the euro, it definitely would affect the dollar. How would see with all this financial crisis happening in Europe and in the United States will affect the dollar as a currency? Would, for example, a strong euro will help the dollar, at least will take some of the burden of all this financial crisis? Thank you.
Well, I think if there's continuing turmoil and uncertainty in Europe, that is to say, if they continue to avoid trying to resolve the underlying issues, then I think the euro will weaken and the dollar will strengthen. But in large part, it depends on what policy the United States itself is trying to pursue. And for the last 3.5 years, we've had an administration which has pursued a weak dollar policy. And they've pursued it because in their view, a weaker dollar helps promote U.S. exports. That's good for jobs, and God knows the economy hasn't recovered at all satisfactorily from the 2008 financial crisis, so the more jobs, the better. I think that is a mistaken view of what our monetary policy ought to be. Number one, because as is so often the case with leftist analysis, it assumes that people have only one role in life, that they're workers, or that we care about workers. The fact is, everybody's a consumer too, and a weak dollar increases the cost of our imports. And because commodity prices commodity prices generally, oil in particular, are denominated in dollars, a weak dollar raises the price of oil, raises the price of raw materials generally, which for consumers increases their cost of living. So this idea that somehow a weak dollar benefits the United States, I just think is wrong as a matter of economics. And I think in any event, as production of goods and services becomes more internationalized, the ability of currency fluctuations to affect your own domestic job situation is considerably reduced. So I think the argument should be in favor of a strong dollar policy, because I think that holds down the cost of raw materials. That's a lot more conducive to economic growth in the United States and worldwide than this idea that somehow we'll be able to export more and that will produce more jobs. And I think it has political benefit for the United States as well. I think that's one of the advantages of a strong dollar. Now, what will happen if the Eurozone goes through more convulsions? You know, all I can say is I have no sympathy for American financial institutions that over 2 years have watched the Europeans stumble around and have not modified their portfolios to reduce their exposure to European sovereign debt and European financial institution equities. You know, if they haven't changed in the last 2 years, I think that's just too bad for them. I mean, I'm not exactly J.P. Morgan, but I've looked at this, and I don't see why they can as well. The reason they might not is the same reasoning you see from financial analysts in the market today, that somebody's going to take care of us. Somebody's going to come to our rescue. This is what economists call the moral hazard. Failure in capitalism is a good thing. You know, capitalism's not only good when people are succeeding. The market has to be able to reward success and penalize failure. And, you know, you can see it in the American domestic context as well when over the past couple weeks, if you look in the Wall Street Journal and elsewhere, as economic statistics have come in still very disappointing, the reporters will quote people from some a hedge fund or some banking institution saying, this is just perfect. Either things get better, in which case the market will go up, or if things get worse, the Fed will come in with quantitative easing 3 and the market will go up too. Well, you know, that's just not the way it ought to work, and I don't know how it will work. You could ask the Fed about that, but I think that the Europeans have made this decision, and I think they ought to be responsible for its consequences. And I think since we've had 2 years' notice, and if anybody doesn't get it now, if any of you from Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs, I'll just tell you my view for what it is. You better rebalance your portfolio and reduce your exposure to European sovereign debt.
Okay, we'll come back to the front row.
Ina Van Beer, La Jolla, California, past president of World Affairs Council. Thank you for sharing the Supreme Court's decision. Lovely to hear. Juxtaposed to the financial crisis, it seems the European did manage to get the healthcare on their way, and many countries are very successful now. We don't get it together. We don't, and I'd like to hear your view of, should we maybe do what you suggest on the financial way in terms of Europe, or what is our next step now?
Well, I think the history of American healthcare over the past 40 or 50 years is that every additional governmental intervention has made it more expensive and in effect reduced consumer choice. And I would start at the beginning in, I think it was the early 1940s, you know, in effectively a New Deal World War II decision that made health insurance non-taxable employer-provided health insurance non-taxable. Now, that sounds like a good thing, right? The employer couldn't care less whether, in terms of the total compensation package for employees, the employer is paying them salary, which is deductible as a business expense, or paying health insurance premiums, which are deductible as a business expense. To the worker, it did make a difference. You'd much rather have insurance, which is non-taxable. And so the consequence over the years is that people became wedded to their employer-provided health insurance. So when people talk today about the problem of portability, when I leave company X, why can't I take my health insurance with me? It's because the government created the bias toward employer-provided health care programs through that intervention in the form of a tax subsidy. And I think portability is a real issue. I'd make the provision of health care insurance taxable. And if you did that, it would lead to very different decisions by labor unions and others as to what kind of mix they want between salary for the workers and compensation in the form of health insurance or life insurance or whatever else there might be. And I think so I mean, that starts with the very first government intervention in health care. And that problem to me goes further on down the line. And it's reflected in this bill in a lot of different respects, mandating health insurance companies to keep children on their parents' health insurance plan up to the age of 26. I mean, I just find that kind of bizarre. If this was such a good idea, why didn't health insurance companies offer it to people? And because they'd make money off of it, it was a good idea. The insurance company, anyway, I don't want to get too hung up in this. But the argument about more government involvement in health care is, well, health care is so important. It's so important. Actually, I think there is something more important than health care. I think food is more important. And you can imagine if we had the government of the United States as involved in the food production and distribution system, where we would be today. And so I just think that this is the direction for the last 70 years has been based on a fallacy and a view by many Americans that Europe has provided the model and we should try and copy them. Now, I mean, I think this is going to be an issue in the election this fall. If we'll have to see exactly what this ruling means, but the argument by proponents of the president's health care proposal and others has been everybody else, meaning in Europe, does this. Why has it taken us so long? And the answer, I think, is that the example that we get from Europe should tell us to go in the other direction. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Professor Thibault from the University of Massachusetts, Dartmouth. I want to thank you, Ambassador Bolton, for this enlightening presentation today. I must confess I'm even more worried now than I was before after listening to you in terms of African connections with the EU. And my question is, given that African nations have always been considered a cash cow for European nations, and with the crisis going on in Europe, some African countries did have their own currency, but many African countries are still tied to the European currency. And some, like Cameroon, had already gone through a couple of devaluation without reducing the price of products for people in the country. If you were to give fiscal advice to those African nations that want to create their own currency or disconnect with the EU currency, what will that advice be? Thank you.
Well, if you look at the CFA franc in particular, which I guess is the single most important example of what you're saying, if you want my humble opinion about what that was about, it was about tying the former French colonies to the metropole forever, And you know, I recognize at the time of independence, there wasn't a lot of latitude for the soon-to-be ex-colonies to negotiate with the French, and the currency wasn't the only problem, and at least in Ivory Coast that I'm familiar with, my understanding is the French kept title to all underground mineral rights too. That was pretty nifty. And I think to get control of national economic policy, the argument would be to break away from the currency relationship. You know, it's not a convertible currency now, other than with the Eurozone, but you are in a completely subordinate position. Now, there is an argument about tying pegging a currency to another foreign currency. That can make sense in some economic circumstances. Hong Kong is pegged to the dollar. The new Taiwan dollar is pegged to the U.S. dollar. Some Latin American countries tried that years ago less successfully. Hong Kong may or may not be on the verge of untying from the dollar because of the growth of the domestic Chinese economy. So, I mean, I think you'd have to look at the particular circumstances, but I don't think there's any question that you are, by participating in that kind of quasi-currency union, you're giving up any possibility of controlling your own monetary policy.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Lyle. I am a dual degree master's student through the Atlantis program, which is through West Virginia University, University of Tartu in Estonia, and Collegium Civitas in Poland. I was wondering if you could explain how you see the role of the U.S. in the world, and if you could further give an example of a time that you have successfully used cultural diplomacy.
I actually have a fairly limited view of the U.S. role in the world. I think our function should be, and the use of all of the resources available to the United States to protect our interests and those of our friends and allies. I don't have expansive notions about nation building or policing the world. But I think we have to recognize there are a lot of threats out there, and as the threats metastasize, as they manifest themselves in things like the 9/11 attack or the proliferation of nuclear weapons in rogue states, it requires somebody to act. And I think that that is frequently the United States, and I think that's inevitable for a long time to come. Whatever limited order and stability there is in the world, and there isn't much, I think it's provided by the United States and its hard power and the hard power of what's left of its alliance structure. It's not provided by the United Nations, that's for sure. And if the United States decides not to provide that order and stability, either one of two things is going to happen. Either nobody else will provide it, in which case you will have an even more anarchic world than we do today, or some other power with less benign views for the U.S.'s friends around the world will provide it, which is also not going to be, I think, terribly helpful. I actually think that most cultural diplomacy is not conducted by the government of the United States, or at least not effectively. The United States is what it is, and it's what its citizens decide it's going to be. And the attractiveness or the spread of U.S. soft power, which is not a phrase I like particularly, is not something really that's in our hands. It's what other people choose to engage in on their own. I don't think the government of the United States is really all that well equipped to use these intangible aspects of the United States to advance our diplomacy. I think that is something that happens without regard to what the government does. I mean, the U.S. I mean, we set up libraries. That's great, and it's helped. I think it has helped us around the world. We have cultural exchange. I think all these things are fine, but I think when it comes right down to it, it doesn't affect power relationships by and large. I think it's a lot more crass. So I'll give you one example. In 2006, we were having an election for non-permanent membership to the Security Council, and Hugo Chavez was trying to get Venezuela elected. and the Latin American group couldn't, which normally the regional groups decide on their candidates. They couldn't decide between Guatemala and Venezuela, so it was thrown open to the whole General Assembly. And we worked very hard to stop the Venezuelans. I mean, we worked very hard. We had every American embassy in the world was pitching in on it. It was an amazing effort. And ultimately what happened is we couldn't get Guatemala elected. They've never been on the Security Council, even though they're an original member of the UN anyway. But we at least blocked Venezuela, and ultimately Panama was elected. But I can't tell you the number of countries I went to, for example, the small island states of the Caribbean, to try and persuade them to go along with Guatemala, only to be told that Venezuela had just built a new police station or just built a new hospital. Even though the island states of the Caribbean rely very extensively on American, Canadian, and European tourism. And cater to those markets, which have the economic wherewithal to go there for tourism. So all of that soft power wasn't worth a thing compared to a new police station, which we didn't have the money. Even if I could have promised it, which I couldn't, we didn't have the money to build it anyway. So it is I think it's. I don't deny at all the importance of the cultural aspects, in some senses political, but the perception of the United States, perception of what kind of country it is. I don't deny that that's important in the world, and I don't deny that it's important that we communicate and explain America better to the rest of the world. I just don't think our government's very good at it. I don't think the government's very good at much of anything, to tell you the truth. But I think in particular, that's why I'm against the Obama health care plan. In particular, I don't think it's very good at public advocacy. And there's some exceptions to that. There's some exceptions to that. But by and large, my experience with it has been pretty wretched. So I think I'm into your break, and I'm sorry that we don't have more time, but I do appreciate your inviting me here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ambassador John Bolton, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.